So I'm here to talk today about police in the Empire City, which to me is hopefully a very useful book to people, in part because I was really interested in the history of policing and how policing changed over time as the population of the United States changed over time. And in particular, I was interested in the literature, there is such siloing around people who are interested in immigration policing and, the history of anti-Black policing in America, the history of policing specific communities, of history, policing and gender, and policing and sexuality, and policing and class, and policing and urban politics and corruption. And I really thought that, I wanted to set out to write a book that put all of these, types of policing in context to one another. That when police, especially in New York City, were policing a Black community, they did so with the knowledge that it happened in the context of how they police Italian communities and Chinese communities as well, and that those how policing operated in those different communities informed one another. And so to that end, also the kind of entwined arguments of the book, which I think map fairly cleanly onto the narrative I have imposed on this book, is one is that there was never really a magical time in which policing in New York was detached from very explicit considerations of race and ethnicity. That the NYPD was founded in 1845 in the midst of migration from specifically Germany and Ireland to the city. And one of the first real questions in how at least what to do with these communities, which were considered to be, biologically more predisposed to crime and criminal activity than other portions of the city. And this happened simultaneously as the early police department became majority, or at least 50% Irish and German. That in exchange for votes for local aldermen who were able to hand out, very lucrative appointments to the police department, that a lot of these appointments were given out to Irish and German immigrants or first generation immigrants, in exchange for the votes of their kinship network. And so very quickly on, the NYPD had to consider both how to police people who they thought were biologically predisposed to crime, a lot of concerns about labor unrest, which were entwined with understandings of working class ethnicity. And simultaneously they had to think about what types of people are the most effective police officers. And here Irish officers uh, served a very interesting function because on the one hand, they were seen as biologically predisposed to be good at violence, which was both a hindrance on society because they were the people who, New York society needed people to police against, but also a special boon to society because they made incredibly effective officers. That what made them foreign and different also made them good at policing because they were good at doing violence. And this eventually led to some problems. So in 1857, you have the state of New York, which is, the state house, which is mostly Anglo and Dutch, kind of older elite of New York State, are so concerned with the makeup of the New York City police force that they create a second alternate police force that is mostly Anglo and Dutch. And the mostly Irish police force and this new force are at war with each other for the better part of a year, which is like the real world manifestation of, working out who is a criminal, who is an officer, and how do we best organize political society in a way that reflects this kind of racial and ethnic hierarchy of belonging and citizenship in the United States. Um, and the other portion of this is, within 10 years of the NYPD founding, within 5 years is the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And so suddenly you have from the very get-go a police department who, by its very legal directive obligation, has to put New York City's very small Black community under surveillance because they are under, specific tasks to try to find self-emancipated individuals in those very small Black communities. And so simultaneously, as they're trying to figure out the ethnic makeup of the criminal underclass of New York and the ethnic makeup of good policing, you have this directive from the federal government to infiltrate and constantly be watching the Black community. And so you have a police department from its very origins that is truly invested in thinking constantly about race and ethnicity and thinking about society as a hierarchy of race and ethnicity, and as that relates to belonging, national belonging. And so by the turn of the 20th century, New York City goes from being 80% native English speaking to 40% in just the span of a few decades. And so the NYPD must contend with how does a majority English speaking police department suddenly subordinate a city that is mostly foreign born and mostly their first language is not English. And where they go to find these tactics of how to patrol such a diverse city is the US empire. And in part, is an intellectual, and in part, this is a really material process. Because on the one hand, you have soldiers and officers coming from the occupation of the Philippines, from Puerto Rico, from Cuba, who are coming into the professionalizing world of law enforcement and seeing a place where they can apply their recently developed skills in a professional way. So they are literally bringing the embodiment of the war into the police departments. And the other thing that happens is intellectual. Is there are all of these reports that are written by the federal government, by the military about how to patrol and police such a diverse and multilingual archipelago as the Philippines. And one of the things they really lean into is a tactic that is very familiar to other empires, to the British Empire, to the French, which is native policing, which is recruiting a centralized body of officers who are useful because of their language abilities, because of their ethnic knowledge, and deploying them into their own communities. And this is exactly what, by 1904, the NYPD calls upon to do in echo of what is happening in the US empire because it was so effective there. And so in 1904, you have the creation of the German squad in the NYPD, the Italian squad in the NYPD, and the hiring of the first Chinese American officer, who are all tasked to do exactly what the Philippine Constabulary is, which is to go into their own communities. So we see here that the problem of how to subordinate immigrant communities, how to control such a multilingual city, requires a very, very explicit consideration of race and ethnicity to the extent that it is changing the very institutional shape of the department. Um, so that is, one argument in the book, and part of this has to do with, policing not only is influenced by race in America, but policing then plays a important role in shaping race and ethnicity in the city. And this is happens both to the officers themselves and to the population. And so, very explicitly, the NYPD says that they consider themselves more than any other institution in the large um, uh, expansive immigration apparatus. They consider themselves the ones most useful at taking immigrants and turning them into Americans. And they do this with violence. And what I call this inclusive violence versus exclusive violence, which I'll get to in a moment. And what inclusive violence looks like is it looks like arrests and brutality and hitting people in the head. But in doing so, they very explicitly say they think they are training people in both the official and unofficial rules of how to be Americans. They are taking immigrant communities and they are forcing them by violence, by coercion, by tickets and arrests to learn the rules of how to behave in American society. They're making them more American. And this is very different than the exclusive violence they see themselves doing in Black communities, which is, specifically violence to deny the access to urban amenities, and to civic belonging to Black populations. And this also takes place inside the department as well. So all of these generations of immigrant officers, which are being recruited in to and deployed into their own neighborhoods, they understand them as being the kind of vanguard of whiteness for their kin. That by putting on a blue uniform, by proving that you are willing to do violence on behalf of the state, and especially racial violence, both against, other immigrants and especially proving violently differentiating yourself from the Black communities of New York City, you are proving that you are white, you have a civic belonging in New York, and that you are compatible with a white supremacist American way of life. Um, and the other major argument is that policing is a kind of global composite. It is a technology where pieces come from all over the world, and you could see it just in that earlier story about the Philippine constabulary. That all of these different pieces come from all over the world and are painstakingly assembled in order to create a technology that is useful for policing a multi-ethnic and multilingual society. And the last story I'll just leave you with is the story of the fingerprint. Fingerprinting is developed by the British Empire in India, in part because the British colonial officers are not very good at telling the difference between people on the ground there. That they need another way of distinguishing people because they cannot tell the difference between people who live on the continent. And so fingerprinting becomes an important tool of subordinating the British Empire because it is a standardized way of understanding people that is compatible with British models of subordinating. Fingerprinting as a technology travels back to Scotland Yard, where it is deemed a magic, the new generation of how people are going to do law enforcement. From there, it's brought to the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, and from St. Louis gets distributed to all these police departments in America, in part because it arrives just at a time when they are figuring out how to subordinate multiracial and multi-ethnic cities. So the same reason why it was so useful to the British Empire in India, it also becomes useful to the NYPD because they can distill people's essences, their personalities down to this totally standardized and legible way of organizing society, which is the fingerprint.